And I'd like to first say hello to everybody who's joined us and welcome to our public seminar from the Department of Education at the University of Oxford. Today, we're extremely fortunate to be able to welcome Professor Antonella Sorace. Antonella was, as we were just saying, actually originally booked to give us an in-person public seminar, which I think was scheduled for, was it May or June of 2020? But of course, the pandemic put a stop to that. But I'm really pleased that we were able to rearrange things and welcome her now, albeit virtually today. Now, just to tell you a little bit about Antonella, if you don't know already, she's a professor of developmental linguistics at the University of Edinburgh. She's one of the world's leading researchers in the area of bilingualism, where her multidisciplinary work focuses on key questions which draws from linguistics, psychology, and cognitive science. She's worked on a number of different issues within the broad remit of understanding bilingual and multilingual development across the lifespan. But she's particularly well known for her work on the effects of bilingualism in non-linguistic domains, her work on linguistic interfaces, and her work on bilingual acquisition in both early and late childhood. And another area for which she has received international renown is in public engagement, having founded the International Research and Information Center Bilingualism Matters, which has centers across the globe and which provides important and accurate, up-to-date information on issues of bilingualism and issues in particular which are relevant for non-academic audiences like educational contexts or business contexts or family contexts. And as it says on the Bilingualism Matters website, speaking more than one language is often undervalued or misunderstood, and Antonella is one of the leading figures that is changing that. So I'm really, really delighted that Antonella is here today to talk about whether we need a monolingual standard. And Antonella is going to talk for about 45 minutes, and then there's an open Q&A session where I believe audience members can type in their questions, and I'll share that process afterwards. So thank you again, Antonella, for being with us this evening. Over to you.
Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm delighted to be with you, although I would rather be with you in person. But this is, the substitute that we have to go with. But thanks very much again. So yes, I do research on bilingualism over the lifespan. Broadly meaning what it means to have more than one language. So bilingualism in a broad sense means more than one, so it could mean, three as well as two. But what I'm going to focus on today is whether it is still appropriate to use a monolingual standard in our research on bilingualism, but also in our public engagement efforts on bilingualism. This is what we normally do. This is normal practice in research on bilingualism. So the normal practice is to have a group of monolingual native speakers, which is compared to a group of bilingual native speakers, bilingual speakers. And then you have a linked comparison of native speakers with non-native speakers. So monolingual native speakers, bilingual non-native speakers. We compare these groups, and any difference between the two is used as evidence for whatever claim we make. So I'm going to question whether that is still an appropriate practice from different points of view. So just to get more into what the question is. So the native monolingual norm, this is common. This goes back a long way in linguistic research. So linguistic research in the last half century has been predominantly done in monolingual Western countries, many in the what we can call the Anglosphere, right, where English is either the national language or the official language or the language that is spoken. And where many people speak only English, actually, although there may be multilingual communities and so on. But the native monolingual norm, is deeply rooted in research on bilingualism. And in fact, in the empirical basis for research in linguistics, are, for example, acceptability judgments. I've done work myself on acceptability judgments as a metric for linguistics. Acceptability judgments are, in a way, consciously reported perceptions of acceptability by educated native monolingual speakers. And this has been the basis for research in linguistics for a long time, a basis that, we can definitely improve from a methodological point of view. But it is still, in many cases, the basis for research in linguistics. Now, in second language acquisition, both from a research point of view, but also in general, courses for second language learning, learning second languages are sold as, you try to speak like a native speaker. So the closer to a native speaker you are, the better you sound, and the better, the course that you're doing is, in fact, and can be sold. But in research, the idea that non-native speakers can become very good. They can reach very high levels of proficiency in a second language, but not quite without becoming exactly like native speakers. So the term near native, that I'm as guilty as anybody else, I've used this in my own research, is a clear indication of this idea that, people can become very, very good indeed. They can get very close to this ideal native speaker without actually getting there. So this is, what we are talking about. And when we talk about the advantages of bilingualism, which is a very large field of research, as we know, particularly in cognitive psychology, but also in other areas. So when we measure the advantages of bilingualism, we always have the comparison with the native monolingual norm. That's how we define advantages of bilingualism or disadvantages of bilingualism. So the norm is being a native monolingual. And then you can measure how different you can be from that point of reference if you know more than one language. So that means that bilingual, if not explicitly, but at least implicitly, means the sum of two monolingual native speakers. And this is something that, as we'll see, is really it's something that is really not right. So a bilingual is not the sum of two monolinguals for many different reasons. But unfortunately, this is what we see in the real world, in many contexts where bilingual abilities are measured on the basis of a comparison with a monolingual norm. So a bilingual implicitly is expected to behave like a monolingual speaker of language A and a monolingual speaker of language B. And many diagnostic tests in education, as well as in health environments, are based on monolingual norms. So, so this is something that we should really be aware of. So, how bilingual are you? First of all, this is the question that we should be asking rather than are you bilingual or monolingual? Because being bilingual, bilingualism doesn't involve binary categorical variables. It's not that you're either bilingual or not. Rather, you can be more or less bilingual according to a variety of parameters that we'll be briefly mentioning. So we're talking about a continuum from less bilingual to more bilingual rather than a dichotomous choice, a categorical choice between being bilingual or not being bilingual. Let's talk about these positive effects of bilingualism that, as I said before, are usually measured by comparison with a monolingual norm. So the positive effects of bilingualism for language have been found in terms of increased metalinguistic awareness, for example. A bilingual, even a young bilingual, has a better awareness of how language works in general, which is not necessarily the result of explicit learning and teaching, but it's just a result of implicit exposure to more than one language. And that means an easier inroad into aspects of literacy that has been found in many studies. So learning to read, certain aspects of learning to read, acquiring literacy, research has been found particularly in acquiring literacy in alphabetic languages, but there is an increasing number of studies on acquiring literacy in non-alphabetic writing systems, and certain aspects of acquiring literacy are facilitated by being bilingual in children. And that means also enhanced language learning skills. So learning a third language or a fourth language is easier if you start from 2 compared to learning a second language if you start from a monolingual basis, so starting from 1. Beyond language, there are many well-known effects that have been also talked about in the media. One that is less perhaps prominent in the media is awareness of other people's perspectives. So a bilingual child developmentally learns that it is possible to have a different point of view or a different perspective compared to your own. So developmentally, bilingual children have been found to achieve that awareness earlier than monolingual children. In bilingual adults, it has been found that the advantage is in how fast you can move from your own egocentric perspective to embrace another person's perspective. Again, this is something that comes from the experience of realizing that not everybody is bilingual, and the experience of having to choose the right language depending on who you speak to and what you're talking about and where you are and all kinds of things. And it's difficult to underestimate the importance of this benefit. And the benefits that the media like to talk about are the benefits for focused attention. So the ability to handle conflicting information. So attention is something that we all have to pay, no matter what we do, because if we don't pay attention, we don't do it well. And also we have to control distractions. So there are always things that potentially take our attention away from what we are trying to do. So the ability to control distractions or inhibit irrelevant information is important, and it has been found to be enhanced by bilingualism, not in all situations, not in all cases, but this cognitive flexibility of adapting to changing circumstances. So task switching, for example, switching from one task that requires attention to certain things to another task that requires attention to different things, and adapting to change. This is very important and very useful no matter what one does, to have that kind of cognitive flexibility. So these effects, why these effects in bilinguals? Because the classic explanation is that the two languages, if there are only two, there may be more than two, but all languages are simultaneously active. And so bilinguals have to exclude the language or languages they don't need when they speak the other. So that's me speaking English and pushing away my native language, which is Italian, as well as the other languages that I know to different degrees, because they're all active and they're not needed right now. So my brain is working over time to pushing them away. Obviously, that means doing this to different degrees in different contexts, depending on whether you're speaking to other bilinguals who also know the same languages as you do. And so there isn't a great need in that case to really inhibit the language not in use, compared to a context where it's quite obvious that nobody would understand if you switch into the other language. So this kind of constant brain, juggling of the languages and focusing on one and excluding the one or the ones that are not needed is what is generalized outside the language domain, and in principle makes people better at handling and monitoring conflicting information. Now, what we know from the media, if you follow this, is that some of these benefits are not found in every single study. So there is a so-called replicability crisis that has been picked up by many media and discussions also in research. So these effects are not found in every single study. In my view, they can't be expected to be found in every single study, precisely because the bilingual experience can be very different. Again, we're not talking about whether you are bilingual or not. We are talking about being more or less bilingual along a continuum defined by many different factors. One example that I'd like to give you is minority languages. So minority languages, by which I mean indigenous minority languages, languages only spoken in certain areas by certain communities. We know that many of these languages are dying. Many of these languages are not spoken to the next generation. And if that process of intergenerational transmission stops, the language dies eventually, and many more of these languages are dying all the time. Now, with respect to these cognitive effects of bilingualism, where do we find the effects? Do we find the effects across all minority languages? And the answer is no. So, for example, there are studies that found, including our own, these effects in Sardinian Italian bilinguals. There are studies that found these effects in Gallic English bilinguals, Frisian Dutch bilinguals also, not completely, but to a large extent. Welsh English, no, these effects haven't been found. Cypriot Greek and Greek, yes, the effects have been found. Catalan Spanish, yes, the effects have been found. Basque Spanish, on the other hand, no, the effects have not been found. So what's going on here? Why are the effects found in some minority languages but not in others? And what we really need to look at is many different factors that are typically not examined in research. So, for example, how the patterns of bilingual use. So we can distinguish between so-called dual language contexts, where both languages are spoken in different contexts. So, for example, Welsh English, the effects are not found. Basque Spanish, the effects are not found. But Catalan Spanish, the effects are found. as opposed to single language contexts where the two languages are really separated. You speak only language A in certain contexts and only language B in a different context. That's the case of Sardinia, for example, where Sardinian is only spoken at home and Italian is only spoken outside the home. And similarly, Cypriot Greek and Greek, Gallic English, Frisian Dutch. Here, in some cases, the effects are found. In fact, in all these cases, single language contexts seem to favor the emergence of these cognitive effects of bilingualism compared to dual language contexts where the effects are more inconsistent. But the other interesting factor, before we get there, I'd like to mention this theory about an adaptive cognitive control system proposed by Abutalebi and Green, for example. Depending on the system, the context in which bilinguals are, they may have to apply more or less inhibition. So in dual language contexts like Catalonia, people don't need to inhibit one language very strongly, because it can be assumed that everybody speaks both languages, and so there is a lot more switching that goes on. But in single language contexts like Sardinia, yes, I mean, you really have to apply quite a lot of inhibition to the language you're not using, because the division is much more precise and stark. So the type of bilingual experience needs to be considered in order to generalize whether the effects are found in minority languages. And another factor that needs to be considered, as a linguist, I would say this is very important and very understudied, is the language distance factor, typological language distance. How distant, how different are the languages in these bilinguals? So we have typologically similar languages like Catalan Spanish, where the effects are found, Sardinian Italian, the effects are found, Cypriot Greek and Greek, the effects are found, Frisian Dutch, the effects are partly found at least, as opposed to dissimilar languages like Welsh and English. The effects are not found. Basque and Spanish, the effects are not found. But Gallic and English, the effects are found. So what lesson can we draw from this? It seems that if you speak similar languages, the effects are more likely to be found, probably because it takes more cognitive effort to inhibit a similar language compared to a different language. But this factor interacts with the other factor that we were talking about. So the kind of community, and place where bilingualism, bilingual communities are placed. So it seems that the effects are more likely to be found in single language contexts where similar languages are found. But we need much more research to really generalize, from studying individual differences due to, for example, language distance or type of language community. So there are lots of modulating factors in bilingualism. Language distance we've just mentioned, exposure to variation, how many speakers does a child hear a language from? This is a very important factor that we always recommend. The more speakers, the better. The more, speakers who inevitably speak in different ways, the better from the point of view of language acquisition, but also from the point of view of perception that the child has about the status of the language. A language that is spoken by more people is a language that is just like the majority language. It's a language that you can do different things in. It's not just mommy's language or daddy's language. It's a language that can be used for exactly the same purposes as the majority language. Literacy, and degree of literacy in minority languages is obviously important. Degree of code code switching, as we said before, and attitudes are incredibly important. And this is another area where we need more research. We did a study a couple of years ago on precisely children's attitudes about their own being bilingual and their own languages. And this is a project funded by the Carnegie Foundation in Scotland. We looked at two different kinds of bilingualism. We looked at bilingualism with Gaelic, so with a minority language, and we looked at bilingualism due to migration, so children coming, you know, from belonging to families who migrated from different language backgrounds, and so who spoke a different language at home, for example. And we actually talked to children, which is something that in cognitive and linguistic research, we typically don't do. We talk to teachers, we talk to parents about the children, but we don't talk to the children themselves. In this project, we actually talk to the children, and we use the methodologies, qualitative methodologies developed by my sociology colleagues who really typically work with children. And so they're able to have conversations with children where you don't lend them the answers, and you actually can trigger, you know, what they really think about what you're asking them to say. So we explored the issue of language and identity. To see how multilingualism is valued and experienced. And we also gave children a bunch of tests, you know, linguistic tests and cognitive tests. And what we found was that positive attitudes really, really matter. So children with positive attitudes in encouraging school and family environments are those that are more likely to show the cognitive benefits of bilingualism. So children who achieved, you know, the best scores on cognitive tests, for example, tended to be from Gaelic-speaking families in Gaelic medium education schools. So a very positive environment. So again, you know, this is something that needs to be taken into account when we work with bilingual children. Their own attitudes can play a very important role, and these are attitudes that obviously they absorb from their environment. So ultimately, we need to encourage positive attitudes in the environment, in schools, in families, and so on. Now, why this, you know, this monolingual norm needs to be abandoned as well? We had a look at different ways of looking at bilingualism and so on, but let's look at also why the monolingual native speaker is not such for life. So, for example, learning a second language changes your first language. And this is true not only in children, but also in adults. And bilingualism or learning languages is becoming more and more common, fortunately, even in the so-called Anglosphere, so in countries where English is the language that everybody speaks. So we have migration, we have exposure to other languages. And so learning another language and bilingualism in this broad sense is becoming more and more common. And so the question is, when does the native language start changing? And we know from research that at the level of vocabulary, so the mental lexicon, the native language actually starts changing very early on. Let me make it clear. I'm talking about people who were born and raised in one language, then they learned another language later on. And all these studies looked at the effects of learning a second language on the first language. So I'm not talking about simultaneous bilingual children who learned, you know, two languages together. I'm talking about people who really were born and raised with one language. Now, access to the mental lexicon is affected very early on. So there are studies on exchange university students, for example, American exchange students who spend a period of time in Spain, right? And experiments were done on these students after a few weeks of full immersion in a Spanish environment. And the access to the lexicon had already changed after a few weeks of full immersion, meaning it became slower, the access to the mental lexicon in the native language, as a result of full immersion and full exposure to Spanish as the second language. What about grammar? So vocabulary is one thing. What about grammar? And what we have been working on is really changes in, as I said, first generation speakers who leave their original community and move to another community. As a result, they get reduced exposure to input in their native language, obviously, because they're not in their community anymore. A reduced exposure to variation among native speakers of the language, which, as we mentioned, is important for language acquisition in children, but it may be important also for language maintenance in adult speakers. So all of that is reduced. On the other hand, there may be conversations and interaction with other native speakers of the same language in the same migrant community. So, and those conversations result in alignment. So speakers tend to copy each other. That's what, the term alignment means, priming. So tending to do what the other speaker does. So studying these interactions among, let's call them attrited speakers, using a term that I don't like. I don't like the term attrition because it has negative connotations. To me, what the changes that we're talking about are natural changes, and they're not necessarily negative changes, as I'll explain better. But anyway, alignment and priming in interactions among these speakers who have left their community results in an horizontal reinforcement of these changes. And what happens then is that these attrited speakers pass on, provide input to their children. And these are so-called heritage speakers, so second generation speakers, who typically get input at least from one parent who's undergoing changes due to attrition. So my children, for example, learned Italian from me, fortunately not only from me, but from me as an attrited speaker of Italian. Now, what happens then is that if heritage speakers hear input in sufficient amounts, they regularize this inconsistent variable input, and that's when the grammar starts changing. And that's how, long-term diachronic changes in languages due to language contact actually happen. So understanding, what happens in first-generation speakers as a result of attrition is interesting and revealing also about how bilingual children acquire minority languages and how languages change in the longer term. So what happens in first generation speakers? Not everything changes. And interestingly, what we see is that the structures that change tend to be the same structures that remain variable in second language speakers who reach a high level of competence in the same language. These structures tend to be the structures that are influenced by pragmatics, influenced by context. So we've done quite a lot of research on pronouns, for example, how people use pronouns. And we found that, just an illustration of Italian, for example, Italian offers a choice between null pronouns, so you can omit the pronoun, and you can use overt pronouns as well. So that's an example of use of a null pronoun. So that says Paula greeted her mother when null went out. And the normal interpretation in bilinguals and monolinguals is it's not the categorical interpretation, but the preferred interpretation is that null pronoun refers to Paula, so the subject of the main clause, rather than her mother, which is the non-subject. when the same sentence is seen with an overt pronoun, so when she overt went out, the preferred interpretation in monolinguals in particular, or in less bilingual people, is that the overt pronoun refers to the subject of the main clause. The overt pronoun refers to the non-subject of the main clause. What happens in bilinguals is that there is a lot more variation for the overt pronoun. So they tend to interpret the overt pronoun also as potentially referring to the subject. So there is a lot of variability that happens in bilinguals, in much more than in less bilingual or monolingual speakers. So these are very selective effects on structures that depend on pragmatic considerations. So you have to consider the context. You have to consider whether you're talking about, something that is equally prominent and salient to both you and your interlocutor. You have to consider the degree of shared knowledge between you and your interlocutor in order to use these pronouns in an appropriate way. Now, we know that there are effects of re-exposure to input. So these kind of changes are at least partly reversible. We did research on re-immersion in the L1 community, in the native community, and we found that these effects, at least in the short run, can be partly reversed. Now, what are the reasons for this convergence between second language learning and first language changes? Well, in both cases, we can say that there is an effect of one grammar to the other. So particularly, say in Italian English bilinguals, there is perhaps an effect of English that doesn't allow null subjects. And so, there are more, an extension of the overt subject because the other language is a language that essentially uses only overt subjects. Except that this is not quite true because the same results have been found in bilingual speakers of two languages that have the same kind of grammar. So two null subject languages like Italian and Spanish, for example, where it's difficult to claim that it's the effect of one language over the other in either direction. So the other possible explanation that we are proposing and exploring is that there are cognitive reasons for these overextension, and so precisely because the use of pronouns depends not only on having a particular kind of grammar and learning another kind of grammar, but also in interfacing grammatical choices with contextual matters and contextual factors. These are the interface conditions that we are looking at, and those interface conditions are affected by general cognitive factors, not only knowledge of linguistic knowledge of particular grammars. So there are bilingual adaptations that lead to these effects on the first language, which are similar to what we find in second language. So, for example, there is a trade-off, a potential trade-off with a good ability to apply inhibitory control that we mentioned before, right? So especially adult bilinguals have learned a second language by applying a lot of inhibition to their native language, because the native language was very dominant, is the language that they grew up with, right? So they become very good at inhibiting, possibly at the expense of integrating information in context and updating the contextual idea of the situation, which is necessary and vital for the use and appropriate use of pronouns, as we said before. So is the fact that we see this, variability in the use of pronoun that leads to an overextension of the overt form, is that a result of this trade-off between being very good at inhibiting and potentially less good at doing the opposite, so pulling things together rather than pulling things apart. But it's also interesting to notice that the form that gets overgeneralized is the most explicit form. So it's not that people start using pronouns randomly. They actually overextend the explicit form, the form that is more redundant, if you want. So in a sense, there is another trade-off between, having a simpler grammar, that partly sacrifices informativeness, but leads to more communication efficiency. So bilinguals go in the direction of being redundant rather than being ambiguous. So they don't sacrifice the understanding the meaning of what they're communicating, because the use of the over pronoun results in more redundancy, and the increased redundancy may also be used, may be a result of what we saw before. So these increased perspective taking, the ability to take the other person's perspective. And so, anticipating that, you really have to avoid ambiguity, because, if you're ambiguous, you're not going to be understood. If you are more clear, than you need to be, at least you're going to be understood. So redundancy is better from a communicative point of view than ambiguity. And bilinguals may be aware of that also as a result of increased perspective taking. So again, we have an adaptive control, cognitive control system that can be shaped in different ways by different types of the bilingual experience. And the hypothesis that we are really pursuing now is that there is an ecosystem between learning, the native language and the second language. So the changes in the first language that we see are absolutely natural. And it might be they may be the other side of the coin. So learning another language, learning a second language may go together to different degrees with changes in the first language. So successful second language learning may actually lead or depend on selective changes in the first language that lead to a potential convergence in the bilingual mind between L1 and L2. And that means that proficient bilinguals are not like monolinguals in either language, which is where we started from, right? So a bilingual can't be regarded as the sum of two monolinguals, but we have additional reasons to draw that conclusion. So a proficient bilingual can't be like a double monolingual, because in order to become a proficient second language user, the native language has to change. So there has to be some kind of cognitive reconfiguration that leads to the two languages coming together, in particular in selective ways, and therefore, a bilingual being necessarily different from a monolingual in both languages. I'd like to conclude with another example, which is really providing very important evidence that monolinguals should really not be used as a point of reference anymore. So multilingual societies and more monolinguals in multilingual societies. So are these monolinguals really monolinguals? If you live in a multilingual society where you hear all kinds of languages, you're exposed, even passively exposed to other languages, does that have an effect on your native languages? Yes, it does. We did research on multilingual classrooms in Scotland, where we tried to foster social integration in multilingual classrooms through shared language learning activities. In the particular case, learning Spanish as an L2. Spanish was new for everybody. And we had more or less multilingual classrooms. So classrooms in which more than 50% of the pupils were multilingual through migration and so on, and classrooms where only 5% of the pupils were multilingual, and the vast majority were monolingual Scottish children. And we gave Spanish language tests after some time, and cognitive tests for both Scottish and migrant children. And what we found was, first of all, that a greater number of multilingual children passed both the Spanish and the cognitive tests compared to monolingual Scottish children, despite the fact that many of these migrant children were still learning English, actively learning English. And we found a very interesting emerging trend that we're trying to collect more evidence for, where monolingual Scottish children in more multilingual classrooms actually performed better in the tests than those in less multilingual classrooms. So we're talking about exposure to multilingualism in a way that doesn't involve active multilingualism, but passive multilingualism. And this study that was done on, not by us, by our colleagues in California, Judy Kroll and Kinsey Boyce, on adults. So passive language exposure in multilingual societies. What they did was they worked on adult monolinguals, so people who define themselves as monolinguals, Americans who said, no, I don't speak any other language but English. Some of them were in California, some of them were in Pennsylvania. Monolinguals in California is a multilingual society to a much greater extent than central Pennsylvania, not Philadelphia, but really central Pennsylvania, which is not really very multilingual. And then they had groups of bilinguals. Everybody had to learn Finnish from scratch. Finnish is a rather challenging language, so nobody knew anything about Finnish. And then after a while, the researchers collected behavioral data through tests, how much Finnish had been learned, but also they measured brain activity in all these groups of participants. And what was found was very interesting. It was found that behaviorally, after a while, there was no difference between monolinguals in California and monolinguals in Pennsylvania. They all had learned some Finnish, reasonably okay. But from the point of view of the brain of the monolinguals in California was more similar to the brain of bilinguals than the brain of the monolinguals in Pennsylvania. So that means that at least, at least one hypothesis is that exposure to multilingual societies can better prepare the brain for language learning. Now, these colleagues don't have long-term data to really show behavioral differences in learning. They're collecting them at the moment. But the fact that the brain reacted in different ways in Californians compared to Pennsylvanians is very interesting and really shows that passive language exposures can have can influence on monolingualism. So I'm coming to an end. The takeaway message that I wanted to get across is that language learning, multilingualism in society can have effects on both monolingualism and nativeness. So historically, we've been using monolinguals as a point of comparison, as a point of reference in linguistic research, in research on bilingualism, to measure attainment, to measure linguistic development, to measure cognitive effects, and so on. But there are now good reasons not to use either monolingual or native speakers as the point of reference to evaluate bilinguals, because we can't rely on the existence of these neatly defined control people. And there are good reasons to adopt bilingualism as a default for any study on language or language processing. So more or less bilingual on a continuum, as I said at the beginning, not either you're bilingual or not, but a continuum of bilingualism as a default for any study that looks at language or language processing. And we know that languages influence each other in all bilinguals. This is not loss. This is the traditional way of interpreting attrition, but attrition is not necessarily loss. It is change, though, and it can be change that is normal, predictable, and also functional to language learning, to second language learning in particular ways. The effects on the first language are visible to different extents, depending on the type of the bilingual experience. And so ultimately, we shouldn't expect bilinguals or multilinguals to behave like monolinguals. In our experiments, certainly we shouldn't expect that, but we shouldn't expect that in society either. And this is a very important message to convey to anybody who makes decisions about bilinguals, either children or adults in their everyday life. So we should compare bilinguals along a continuum, bilinguals with other bilinguals, more bilinguals with less bilinguals. And ultimately, we should avoid dichotomies. We should really look both ways. And I'm saying this as someone who's grown up academically with rigid dichotomies. And I've now, come to the conclusion that really, it's not just a question of looking at cognitive versus social, or universals versus variation, or biology versus culture, or innate versus learned. We should really look both ways, and we should, work together to integrate what we learn by looking at both ways rather than just looking one way only. So we need many more bridges across subfields of research on language learning, bilingualism, and obviously we need bridges between research and society, because we can learn a lot by talking to society and people who, as I said, make decisions, live with bilingualism in everyday life. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Antonella. I'm clapping on behalf of everybody else who I'm sure are clapping in their homes or wherever they are. That was really interesting, and really enjoyed hearing that really fantastic summary of all of those different sorts of interactions between bilinguals and cognitive systems and the impacts of that. And I think there are many educational implications for what you're talking about as well, in terms of multilingual environments and so on. So thank you so much for this.